Thank you very much. I'm going to be talking about objectively monitored walking in older adults and the factors that shape them, because that's kind of my shtick. And I remember one grant that I got rejected on, of many, and one of the reviewers had said, I have no idea why she continues to be obsessed with steps per day, because it is, technology is moving far beyond that, and I'm going, so anyways, why? So I'm very interested in walking, ambulatory behavior, anything with the legs move. So to me, running is faster walking, and the tango and the waltz and the polka are just credentialed walks in the ministry of silly walks. So it's all good for me. It's all walking, right? And I'm interested in that because I think walking is, well, it's the first activity that's reported on physical activity surveys about preferences for walking for exercise. And also I believe it's a fundamental part of everyday activity and functioning. We are walking all the time. Just to go to the bathroom, we have to walk to get there. So it's a universal sort of behavior throughout the lifespan for most people, and so I'm very interested in it. And then people say, well, why steps? Why steps? I mean, we have minutes, we have calories, we have minutes, we have MBP. I'm very interested in steps because, well, one, I think everybody understands steps. I can work with people who are low numeracy, low literacy. They get it right away when we're talking steps. I think steps is, unlike, for example, activity counts for those who follow objective monitoring, there is a criterion, there is a gold standard for steps. We can see them. We can objectively measure them. And Patty is now doing work where she shadows people and checks out steps in free living. So there is an objective criterion. We know what it is. So I'm very interested in this. I'm interested in practical, not that others are impractical, but I'm interested in practical health solutions related to physical activity. And so I settle on these simple, translatable, easy to understand metrics. And those of us that have been in the field for a while have used a range of devices for assessment. And fortunately, most of these assessment devices actually have in there somewhere the capacity to measure step, which makes me excited because there's an opportunity to translate between all these various devices, and between biomechanics labs, and between clinical settings, and between free living. And we can all get around the idea of step. And I'd like to think that some of the work that Dave has done, and Wendy has done, and myself and others, has laid the foundation for this new generation of consumer tracking. We started talking about how many steps are enough, how many steps are too few, and I believe that we were the pioneers setting out that sort of foundation for this new commercial enterprise, because people can now understand these devices a little more thoroughly. So, getting back to older adults, how much walking do older adults do? And I'm specifically talking about objective monitoring. So these are NHANES data, and gotta watch that. 5 to 80 years of age. We actually, these are the accelerometer data, and specifically steps. We've actually published the older adult data. We've published the kids' data. We're just having a devil of a time publishing the healthy aging, adults in between that. Yeah, we're having a hard time publishing that, but eventually I hope to show the entire span here. And these are just the percentile divisions here for men and women as we're going through the aging process or the lifespan process. And I see these as data that I call them benchmark data, I call them reference data, I call them normative data. It's so that we can figure out, just like the BMI growth curves, if we have a 75-year-old who's taking X number of steps and they're female, we can look at them relative to these. And in these publications, we've actually provided much more detail so that you'll know the 5th percentile for an 80-year-old and so on. And so that's a way of actually providing some data that are reference data. Previous to that, we've just kind of been pulling studies together and kind of chopping it up, and we've pulled that together, and that's very useful. But we need more studies that provide these sort of reference data. Now, those are older adults without any consideration for their conditions. And we've also started pulling together the data to provide some sort of reference values for how many steps older adults take who are living with diseases or other disabilities or chronic conditions and so on, and seeing how they impact. Now, when we first undertook this approach, we pulled together all the various different disease conditions. The number behind them is the number of studies that we found that reported steps per day. And so we're starting to see the pattern. Now, this needs to be updated. There are many more studies now. The literature is actually growing, burgeoning now, with steps per day being reported, even if it is an adjunct measure, which warms the cockles of my heart that we're seeing this sort of information being shared. But you can see that with some diseases, it may not affect activity as much. So let me zoom in on an example here. So breast cancer survivor, the critical word being survivor, they're around 8,000 steps per day because they're survivors and otherwise uncompromised perhaps by their condition. But when we have here disabled older adults, they're in around 1,000 steps per day. So it just gives you a kind of an idea of expected value, because all of us in the room know here, there's no such thing as a stereotypical older adult. At 80 years of age, somebody could be taking 1,800 steps per day, and their neighbor across the street could be taking 12,000 steps per day. So there's a huge range on older adults. So how much walking should older adults do? We've had a little bit of debate on here. We do know that, there have been some recommendations out there that they should be given the same sort of public health recommendation as adults. That age alone does not require a reduced dose, perhaps. It's as we transition to diseases or conditions that otherwise limit our activity, we maybe shift from a public health perspective to more of a rehabilitation perspective. And that's a different approach to physical activity than a more generic sort of delivery of recommendation of physical activity. And so a number of years ago, I have a number of wonderful colleagues from around the world who've had firsthand step data collection experience in a range of populations. We all came together. We found all the literature that was out there at the time that had steps per day and objectively measured moderate to vigorous physical activity as well. And we tried to do a translation, like what are the steps per day associated with objectively measured moderate to vigorous physical activity that meets public health recommendations for the various groups. It's fragmented because that's the way the literature is. But I'm going to zero in here on the healthy older adults, those 65 plus, otherwise unlimited by their conditions and so on. We have a flat bar at the bottom here that says that's the lowest study that we could find that had a value here. And so that's about 7,000 steps per day was the lowest value associated with meeting public health recommendations for MVPA. We put an arrow up here. This marks the high study that we could find, but it points towards higher because we believe that higher is better. Additional benefits can come from adding in vigorous activity. We wanted to acknowledge that, but that's kind of an idea here. Now, individuals living with disability or chronic illness, there was actually only one study at the time. I'm sure there's going to be more now, but it kind of gives you an idea here. But again, it's not that we're asking older adults to take only 2,000 steps. We're actually trying to get them up around the 7,000 level, which is a level we might also ask, adults to take. So at least in this literature, it wasn't necessarily limited by age alone. So how many steps per day are too few? This is something, actually, I think it was Wendy posed this question to me one time, you know? I've made a good career on the how many steps per day are enough, and she just poked at me once, yeah, but how many are too few? And I went, oh. So now I'm building my career in that area. So I actually brought together a number of my good American and Canadian friends on this one, and we thought, you know, is there a way that we can provide some step per day indices and try to make sense of all these various definitions that are flying around and try to get some sort of agreement in them? So this was kind of our attempt. So I will walk you through this. That was a joke. Okay. So there are some that say that if you are physically active, that means you meet MVPA recommendations. few in this group will argue with that. If somebody is labeled physically active, they meet MVP recommendations. Now, Dave and I worked a number of years ago on this sort of graduated step index. And so I took some liberties here in the sense that I've also done some studies that have shown that meeting public health guidelines is equivalent to making about 7,500 steps per day. 10,000 is laudable. Absolutely, go for it. 12,000 is even better. Heck, be Amish. 18,000 if you're a man, right? That's fine. There's no problem with that. But if you want a direct translation at MVPA, the literature that we have found and a study that we conducted said 7,500, you're in the money. So that's why we drew 7,500, physically active lifestyle, meeting MVPA, you're physically active. Now, going down here, it was Hamilton who suggested at some point when you're physically inactive, it's characterized by non-exercise physical activity deficiency. So what he meant was you're not only not exercising, but you're also not doing the stuff that's not exercise. The other part of the physical activity that's not exercise. We put that down here. And then we said, okay, so if you're not meeting MVPA recommendations, by default, you must be physically inactive. So we put not meeting physically MVP up here, but you're actually not meeting it down here too. But at this level, not only are you not meeting MVPA, but you're also not puttering around, if you will, right? There's a lack of movement. It's characterized by higher accumulated time and sedentary behavior. And so we've called that less than 5,000 steps per day. In this article, we talk and debate about alternatives to that, but we're settling in on this, and that's my story, and I'm sticking to it, okay? Now, I have been challenged by some of my Japanese colleagues that say, wow, that's a big kind of range there, Catrine. And actually, it was Yoshiro Hatano who said to me, hey, you should have a level down here called The Walking Dead. And I thought, that's very clever, but I don't think it will fly. But so I don't have it in this paper, but we actually have separated this 5,000 out to 2,500 to 5,000, we call it limited activity, and less than 5,000, we call it basal activity, for lack of better words. So factors that shape walking behaviors. I'm kind of taking liberties in this next part because this is a knowledge gap in terms of objectively monitored activity in older adults. So that's my caveat. But we do know that factors associated with taking less than 5,000 steps per day, and this was a body of literature we pulled together around objective monitoring, include sex. So women almost universally take less steps than their similarly aged male counterparts. Age. We see a reduction in steps per day across age. Now, not maybe from 70 to 75, but if you look at the full age range, as I showed up there a little while, you can see age characteristic patterns. And so as we age, we expect a decrease in steps per day, and the people who are taking less than 5,000 are characteristically older. Race, ethnicity, African American populations, according to NHANES data, is a factor associated with taking less than 5,000 steps per day. Income, lower income, smoking status, current smoking, obesity, and having multiple conditions. So these are factors that can shape people's steps per day and propel them down. Now we know that in generality, but I can't tell you if you have 3 conditions, you're going to be taking 1,500 steps per day left. Or if diabetes reduces your steps per day more than PAD, I don't know. Those are literature gaps. Those are important literature gaps that need to be discussed and stick some PhD students onto. In general populations, we know that places to walk to are going to shape steps per day. So King showed that places to walk to, 0 destinations, you're around 3,000 steps per day. If you have 1, you're over that. And if you have 2 to 11, you can be up over 5,000 steps per day. So having places to walk to, as you know from yesterday, right? If you walked out for dinner or whatever, if you walked anywhere, if you had places to walk to, then you increased your activity. If you took the bus and then a taxi home, You didn't get as many steps. Not so much. You're in the Walking Dead level. Transportation, we know that, for example, if you take a commuting mode of a car, you have fewer steps per day than if you take a commuting choice that might include some extra walking. And so working with my Japanese colleagues, they tell me that people who commute by train are taking 9,000 steps per day. That is a form of act, and you say, but they're on the train. But it's the act of getting to the train and getting off of the train and getting around the city in between the train. That's a little different from door to door and door to garage car driving. And perceived nighttime safety. Again, this is a general population, but here's an example of perception affecting steps per day in these populations. Those those places where people think they're safe, men and women, they're going to have higher steps per day than when they think an area is unsafe. So these are perceptions that seem to be shaping factors, shaping objectively monitored steps per day. Now again, that's the generality of the literature right now. Right now, I can't tell you if you have sidewalks in your neighborhood that will increase steps per day in your neighborhood by 1,000 steps. I can't tell you whether having street lights are going to increase steps per day in the neighborhood by 1,800 steps. We don't have that level of precision. I believe it is possible to come up with those numbers. We just don't have that information at this point. I threw this in because we were talking about this yesterday and a little bit today as well. Some of you in the audience know what I'm trying to get at here when I speak about life space diaries. And I apologize, I don't have the originator up there. And if anybody knows, please yell it out. But the concept of life space diaries has been applied to the older adult in the home, in institutions, in the community. And essentially it suggests, for example, in your own home, this might be your house, this is outside in your neighborhood, this is out in the greater community, this is outside your city, what have you. And a person can just report the number of times they move from one concentric circle to another, but also the frequency by which they do this. And this concept is similar to the idea of out and about. And in the UK, Janice Thompson and her group have been looking at older adults' activity related to just getting out and about. And they've been showing that this actually translates to objectively monitored steps per day, increases in that. The more times you get out and about. This should come as no surprise to everybody. You know, on the days when you're homebound or you're inside writing that article or whatever, you have nothing on your Fitbit, right? And then the days when you are at conferences and you're trying to find your way around and so on, then you are much higher. And so this is a very simple concept. Again, I'm a simple person. Where is Tom? There you go. I guarantee you'll understand all my crap. Yes. Yeah, okay. Yeah, you understand my crap. Okay, and that's what I aim for. And this concept of a life space diary, again, this is a concept that I think is a research opportunity for somebody to speak about as you go in and out of your life space. What kind of value is that to your steps per day, to your objectively monitored steps per day? I think there's a great opportunity for somebody there. Okay, now, one of the other criticisms I get from time to time is that, oh God, you keep talking steps per day, that's volume, you know, you're forgetting about a central tenet of public health recommendations, intensity, and so on, and there is value to that. And so thinking about that, I went, yeah, but all of us know that if you walk faster, that increases intensity. It's a very simple concept. Again, I'm a simple person. And so this idea of walking speed, I'm trying to look at cadence, so the steps per minute that Dave was talking about. And so you might know it because your field might talk about it differently. Step frequency, step rate, stride frequency, stride rate, walking tempo, steps per minute, a beat to walk to, staying alive, whatever you want, right? But it's the idea of this, right? And when you do the tango, it's got to step back and forward. It's the funny walk, right? Okay, so in 2005, we did a study. Actually, we just replicated Patty's notorious study where she calibrated the actigraph and she came up with 1952 for activity counts. All we did was we copycat, right? And we did it for steps per minute, or cadence. And we said 100 steps per minute is equivalent to 3 minute activity. Now, yes, it was 97 for one person and 103 for another, but you know, from my point of view, simple person, heuristic values, you step back and you go, looks like 100, right? Well, since that time, there have been 4 other studies that have done this, and they say, yeah, she's right, 100 will work, right? Now that's amazing agreement in my field of objective science, where we often will refer jokingly to cut point wars, right? And I'm going, it's steps, it's these things, right? However we measure it. So I'm excited about that. So I spun it into a few other things. I said, look at all the studies that have looked at cadence and intensity, and speed, and look at all the studies that have looked at it related to MENTs. There's something here, there's something we need to keep looking at. So, I mean, these are objective accelerometer data. And 1 for every minute, because this subject wore it for 24 hours, 1,440 minutes in a day. And you can see these are the steps per minute. And some of you are already just waiting to pounce on me and say, but what about the instantaneous pace, right? And I'm going, I'm a simple person, okay? I like minute because it's a human scale time frame. I like it from a free living point of view because I like the idea of a step accumulation pattern. So at the lower end of the step accumulation pattern, it might have shown I've done a little bit of sporadic incidental movement. And as I start to go higher and higher, it means that I'm more closely getting to what we would call walking. Forward, rhythmic, progressive movement through space. And so I'm interested in these values. And so these are data for N. Haynes. And these are cadence bands, I call them. These are minutes at 0 cadence, minutes at 1 to 19, and all these other cadence patterns here. And what I want to point out are these 2 here are congruent with sitting. I didn't say they measure sitting. They are congruent with sitting, okay? And then as we go on these higher cadences, they become less and less congruent with sitting. And nobody who is doing 120 steps per minute is sitting, okay? And what I wanted to point out here from an aging point of view is that the older people are taking a very high amount of these 0 cadence, and then less time is spent at these higher cadences. And the same is for men. They spend more time in the 0 cadences and less time in these higher cadences. There we are, back to this again. Just a quick concept I want to get in before I get this sad face, right? We take these and we rank order them. And I find the top 30 minutes of your day, the best 30 minutes of your day. And I call that peak 30-minute cadence. That is your best natural effort for that day. I find the average of that, and it's merely an index of your best natural effort. For a runner who runs 45 minutes, I get their top 30 minutes, and that one person will be averaging about 150 peak cadence. A walker might be averaging 111. Somebody who goes up and down Walmart aisles will be around 68, and a shut-in will be around 20. So I'm using this in an index. The nice thing about it is normally distributed, just like steps per day, as opposed to time in MVPA, which those of you who study it know it's very highly skewed. So it's a fun index that I'm working with. I want to show that peak 30 and peak 1 being your best one, they go down with age. So I just wanted to give you that. And I just want to summarize with a number of research gaps in this area that you can send your PhD and postdoc students to chew on if you want, because it's way more than I could ever do. We need additional data on expected values for different conditions. We need clearer values for screening purposes. So when do we intervene? How many steps are too few? When do we send up the red flag? We need cadence, to look at cadence as a simple form of pattern recognition. We need to look at steps per day cadence related to health parameters. I envision like a barometer when we say this is related to disease, dementia, and this is related to depression, and so on. Clinically meaningful differences in steps per day is an increase of 1,000 good, 2,000. Strategies for increasing steps per day cadence in older populations, effectiveness of steps per day cadence interventions, and calibration of contextual factors in terms of steps per day. So what is the effect of adding sidewalks and so on like that in these objective, translatable, simple terms? And that's it.